What should have been a fragile moment after a premature twin birth becomes something far more disturbing when a woman falls into a month-long coma and power quietly changes hands. While machines keep her alive, her husband and family laugh, sign documents, and decide her fate as if silence means consent. They believe money, authority, and procedure can erase a woman who cannot speak. Then a senior doctor walks into a closed room and places a thick medical file on the table. Inside are timelines, signatures, and numbers that reveal a very different truth. What follows is not chaos, but precision, exposure, and justice, moving slowly forward. Trust me, you will not see how this ends until we dive in. Let us know what time you are listening and where you are tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We would love to hear from you. The intensive care unit carried a silence that felt deliberate, shaped by discipline rather than peace, where every sound seemed carefully measured and controlled. Fluorescent lights reflected off glass walls, stainless steel rails, and polished floors, creating a sterile brightness that erased any sense of time. Behind one of those glass partitions lay Laura Mitchell, motionless on a narrow hospital bed, surrounded by machines that breathed, counted, and watched in her place. 30 days earlier, everything had changed within minutes. An emergency delivery had been called without warning, alarms sounding as doctors rushed her through swinging doors. The twins had been delivered too soon, their cries thin and urgent, their bodies small enough to fit easily within gloved hands. Laura had not followed them with her eyes. She had not spoken another word. Now, her body rested under a white blanket, shoulders still, face pale, lips slightly parted as a ventilator guided each breath. A heart monitor traced steady green lines across its screen, punctuated by rhythmic beeps that echoed softly through the room. The smell of antiseptic lingered in the air, sharp and clean, masking anything warm or familiar. A physician stood near the foot of the bed, reviewing Laura's chart with a neutral expression shaped by years of experience. He spoke quietly to the nurse beside him, explaining that neurological response remained minimal. Brain activity could not yet be fully assessed. Recovery was possible, but uncertain. His voice held caution, not hope. Outside the glass wall, Daniel Mitchell listened attentively, hands folded in front of him, posture straight and composed. He nodded at appropriate moments, absorbing information without interruption. When the doctor finished, Daniel thanked him politely, his tone calm, controlled, and free of visible emotion. He did not step closer to the glass. Margaret Mitchell stood beside her son, her gaze fixed not on Laura, but on the doctor. She asked practical questions about duration, resources, and expected progression. Her voice was steady, deliberate, shaped by years of managing outcomes rather than emotions. When the doctor emphasized uncertainty, she acknowledged it with a brief nod. A few steps away, Evelyn Brooks leaned against the wall, arms crossed loosely, observing the exchange with quiet confidence. She did not speak, yet her presence filled the space. When her eyes moved toward Laura's bed, they held curiosity rather than concern, as if she were studying a situation already decided. Inside the room, Laura's hands rested atop the blanket, fingers relaxed, unmoving. A faint bruise marked her wrist, where an intravenous line had been adjusted earlier that morning. Her hair was pulled back neatly, revealing a face stripped of makeup and expression. She looked smaller than she had before, diminished by stillness and silence. The nurse entered the room to check vitals, her movements practiced and gentle. She adjusted tubing, checked monitors, and recorded numbers without pause. For a brief moment, she looked at Laura's face and hesitated, her eyes softening. She whispered nothing, then stepped back, closing the door quietly behind her. Down the corridor, beyond another secured unit, the twins lay in separate incubators, their bodies fragile and dependent on careful calibration. Their chests moved quickly, supported by soft oxygen flow. Nurses spoke in hushed tones, documenting each breath, each fraction of weight gained. Laura did not hear them. She did not feel their presence. A resident physician passed Daniel and Margaret in the hallway, offering a brief update with professional restraint. He explained that Laura remained stable, though unchanged. Daniel responded with a measured acknowledgement. Margaret asked whether this level of support could be maintained indefinitely. The physician answered cautiously, emphasizing balance and ethics. Evelyn shifted her weight, glancing at her phone before looking back toward the glass wall. She remarked quietly that the hospital seemed efficient. Margaret agreed, noting the quality of care. Their exchange was brief, practical, and devoid of sentiment. Laura's name was not spoken. Inside the room, the machines continued their steady work. The ventilator released air with a soft hiss. The monitor beeped again, consistent and indifferent. Each sound confirmed life, yet revealed nothing of awareness, memory, or pain. Laura existed within numbers and signals, defined by data rather than voice. A janitor pushed a cart past the unit, slowing slightly as he noticed the family standing outside the glass. He glanced toward Laura, then away, resuming his work without comment. In this place, movement continued regardless of circumstance. Daniel checked his watch and exhaled quietly. He said something about stepping out to make a call. Margaret followed him without hesitation, heels clicking softly against the floor. Evelyn lingered a moment longer, looking through the glass with a faint, unreadable expression, then turned away. Their voices carried faintly down the corridor as they spoke about schedules and obligations. The tone was light, almost casual, shaped by fatigue rather than grief. The distance between their conversation and the room behind them felt vast, though separated only by glass. The doctor remained for a moment, standing alone outside the room. His gaze returned to Laura, scanning her still form with quiet focus. He had seen many patients suspended like this, caught between possibility and loss. Experience had taught him that danger did not always announce itself loudly. He turned and walked away, carrying unanswered questions with him. Behind him, the lights reflected against the glass, creating a faint double image of Laura's body, as if she existed in two places at once, a woman present in form, absent in voice. Inside the room, night protocols dimmed the lights slightly, casting softer shadows across the walls. The machines continued their rhythm, unaltered by time or circumstance. Laura's chest rose and fell, each breath assisted, each moment measured. Beyond the hospital walls, traffic moved, phones rang, and ordinary life continued uninterrupted. Inside, Laura remained alone, with the sound of machines and the weight of silence. Her body lived. Her awareness remained unreachable. And in that suspended stillness, her story waited. Contained within a single room, defined by a moment that had not yet ended. Control did not arrive with raised voices or dramatic decisions. It settled quietly into the hospital through signatures, procedures, and the authority granted to those standing outside the glass. After the doctors completed their rounds, the atmosphere around Laura Mitchell's room shifted from concern to management. The urgency of the first days faded, replaced by routine, structure, and decisions made without resistance. Daniel Mitchell became a constant presence at the nurse's station rather than beside his wife's bed. He reviewed documents with focused attention, asking questions about process rather than prognosis. Consent forms were explained in clear medical language, and he listened carefully before signing. His pen moved smoothly, confident, as though these papers belonged to corporate meetings instead of life-sustaining care. Margaret Mitchell remained close, her posture firm, her tone composed and authoritative. She asked about schedules, insurance coverage, and expected durations with calm precision. When staff members spoke in emotional terms, she redirected the conversation back to practicality. In her view, clarity and order were not cruelty, but responsibility. Evelyn Brooks began appearing more frequently, walking through restricted hallways with the ease of someone who felt entitled to be there. She greeted staff politely, exchanged brief words with Daniel, and waited nearby during updates. Her presence was never questioned, even when it unsettled some of the nurses. She carried herself with confidence, as though the situation had already resolved itself in her favor. Inside the ICU room, Laura remained sedated, her body still responding to machines and medication. Adjustments were made according to protocol, small changes explained as stabilization measures. Daniel approved each modification after brief explanations, trusting the terminology more than his instincts. Words like precaution and consistency reassured him enough to continue. Nurse Helen Moore noticed the pattern during her shifts. Medication levels were increasing gradually, not sharply enough to raise alarms, but consistently enough to keep Laura deeply unresponsive. Helen documented everything carefully, following instructions while quietly noting the changes. She told herself this was not her decision to make. The twins remained in the neonatal unit, separated from their mother by corridors and security doors. Nurses monitored their breathing, feeding schedules, and body temperature with quiet diligence. They were stable but fragile, each day a cautious step forward. Laura was not brought updates. Decisions about access were deferred without discussion. Daniel visited the nursery briefly one afternoon, standing behind the glass with his hands in his coat pockets. He watched the babies for a moment, then nodded to the nurse and stepped away. There were no questions about holding them, no inquiries about bonding. He believed there would be time for that later. Margaret approved of this distance. She believed emotional restraint protected people from disappointment. Attachment, in her mind, could wait until outcomes were clearer. She spoke with hospital administrators about long-term care planning, ensuring every option remained controlled and predictable. Evelyn accompanied her during these conversations, listening attentively and offering occasional remarks about efficiency. She commented on how smoothly everything was being handled, how professional the staff appeared. Margaret agreed, reassured by the sense of order. Laura's condition became an abstract point in a broader discussion. Back in the ICU, Helen adjusted an intravenous line and checked Laura's vitals again. The numbers were stable, but the stillness felt heavy. She looked at Laura's face, searching for signs of response that were not there. For a brief moment, she considered speaking up, then reminded herself that everything had been approved. A resident physician approached Daniel later that day to discuss ongoing sedation. He explained that maintaining consistency reduced unpredictability, though it carried long-term considerations. Daniel listened carefully and asked whether this approach minimized complications. When the physician answered cautiously, Daniel accepted the reassurance and signed the continuation order. Helen observed the exchange from across the hall, her expression unreadable. She felt the familiar tension between duty and discomfort, a line she had walked many times before. Orders were clear. Consent was documented. There was no formal reason to intervene. Morning light filtered through narrow windows, casting pale reflections across the floor. Laura's room looked unchanged, her body unmoving beneath the blanket. Another adjustment was made, another form added to her chart. The process continued without pause. Daniel arrived later than usual, holding a cup of coffee he did not drink. He stood at the foot of the bed and studied Laura's face, trying to recall the last conversation they had shared. The memory felt distant, softened by time and circumstance. He told himself she could not hear him. Margaret joined him, reminding him of obligations waiting outside the hospital. She suggested reducing visits to avoid emotional strain. Daniel agreed, relieved by the structure her guidance provided. Evelyn waited nearby, checking her phone, untroubled by the silence in the room. A young nurse mentioned subtle variations in Laura's vitals during a handoff. Margaret responded gently but firmly, stating that the medical team would address anything significant. The nurse nodded and stepped back. The hierarchy was clear, and it did not include personal concern. In the neonatal unit, the twins continued their quiet fight for strength. A nurse placed a hand against the incubator and whispered encouragement, documenting progress in careful detail. Laura's name appeared on the chart, though she remained absent from the space. As evening returned, the hospital settled into its familiar rhythm. The family gathered briefly in the waiting area, discussing next steps in measured tones. No one spoke of fear or hope. They spoke of management, of preparation, of what seemed sensible. Inside the ICU room, lights dimmed as night protocols began. Machines continued their steady cadence, indifferent to intention or emotion. Laura's chest rose and fell, each breath assisted, each moment governed by decisions made beyond her reach. Control had become complete, not through force or urgency, but through silence and procedure. Laura remained alive, contained within boundaries defined by others. Outside the glass, footsteps faded down the corridor, leaving her alone with the sound of machines and a life being directed without her voice. Dr. Samuel Carter reviewed charts the way he always did, methodically and without expectation, letting patterns reveal themselves rather than forcing conclusions. The intensive care unit had settled into routine, and routine often hid the most important details. He stood at the workstation, scrolling through Laura Mitchell's electronic records with the quiet patience earned over decades. At first glance, nothing appeared overtly wrong. Vital signs were stable, oxygenation adequate, heart rhythm consistent. The system flagged no urgent warnings. Yet something in the sequence of entries felt misaligned, not dramatic enough to trigger alarms, but persistent enough to demand attention. He leaned closer to the screen and began comparing timestamps. Medication adjustments appeared small when viewed individually, each justified by clinical language and proper authorization. However, placed side by side, they formed a gradual escalation. Dosages had increased incrementally, always within acceptable ranges, yet trending steadily upward. Dr. Carter pulled a chair closer and opened the pharmacy log. The timing of each change aligned closely with episodes of hypotension recorded by the monitors. Blood pressure dips were not isolated events. They clustered after specific medication modifications, repeating with quiet consistency. He called up the nursing notes next, reading them line by line. The entries were thorough, professional, and restrained. Nurse Helen Moore had documented every shift with precision, noting observations without interpretation. Her language was careful, perhaps too careful, as if aware that words carried weight. Dr. Carter paused and looked through the glass wall into Laura's room. She lay exactly as she had for days, unmoving, sedated, preserved in a state of controlled stillness. The machines around her worked flawlessly, too flawlessly, he thought, for a patient whose condition should have shown some variation. He returned to the screen and opened the authorization records. Each medication adjustment bore a clear approval, signed digitally by the same individual, Daniel Mitchell. The consistency of the signature was striking. There were no gaps, no delays, no missing confirmations. Dr. Carter did not assume intent. Experience had taught him that most anomalies resulted from misunderstanding or procedural inertia. Still, the pattern demanded scrutiny. He printed several pages and placed them side by side, aligning times, dosages, and physiological responses. As he worked, Nurse Helen approached quietly. She sensed his focus and waited until he looked up. When he did, she spoke carefully, choosing her words with professional restraint. She asked whether everything looked as expected. It was not a challenge, only an opening. Dr. Carter nodded once, then asked a simple question. Had Laura shown any spontaneous responses during recent shifts? Helen hesitated briefly before answering. She said there had been none worth noting, though she admitted the depth of sedation made assessment difficult. He thanked her and returned to the charts. Helen remained nearby for a moment, then resumed her duties. As she walked away, Dr. Carter noticed the tension in her shoulders. It was subtle, but familiar. The posture of someone following orders while holding unanswered concerns. He opened the monitor data next, reviewing raw waveforms rather than summarized reports. The data confirmed what the logs suggested. Each deeper sedation phase corresponded with reduced variability. Laura's body was being held steady, almost artificially so. Dr. Carter straightened and exhaled slowly. This was not negligence. It was not error. It was something quieter and more dangerous. A system operating exactly as instructed, without questioning whether the instructions served the patient. Later that afternoon, Daniel Mitchell arrived for his daily check-in. He greeted the staff politely and asked whether there were updates. Dr. Carter explained that Laura remained stable, using the same language he had used before. Daniel nodded, appearing reassured by the familiarity. Daniel then asked whether the current approach remained appropriate. He spoke calmly, framing the question as concern for predictability. Dr. Carter answered carefully, emphasizing balance and caution. He avoided speculation, choosing words that neither accused nor concealed. As Daniel left, Dr. Carter watched him disappear down the corridor. There was no visible urgency in his step, no sign of fear or conflict. He moved like someone confident that processes were under control. The thought lingered uncomfortably. Doctor. Carter returned to his office and reviewed Laura's admission notes. The initial diagnosis cited prolonged psychological stress preceding delivery. There was no evidence of neurological trauma during surgery, no complications that justified prolonged deep sedation beyond standard care. He compared Laura's course with similar cases from recent years. None matched the trajectory exactly. Others had shown fluctuations, attempts to lighten sedation, moments of response. Laura's path was unusually linear, smooth, managed. That evening, Dr. Carter requested additional data access under the guise of routine review. He cross-referenced pharmacy records with consent timestamps again. The approvals were prompt, often immediate. Someone was paying close attention to ensure continuity. He considered involving a committee, then decided against it for now. Questions required clarity before escalation. Premature conclusions could undermine legitimate care. Still, he saved copies of the records to a secure folder, labeling them carefully and precisely. In the ICU, Helen adjusted Laura's IV line during her night shift. She checked the monitor and recorded stable readings. As she worked, she glanced at Laura's face, searching for signs that never came. The stillness felt heavy, unnatural. Helen remembered earlier cases where patients had stirred unexpectedly. Small movements, changes in breathing. Laura had shown none. She wondered whether that was normal or engineered, then pushed the thought aside. Her role was not to decide. Near midnight, Dr. Carter stood again outside Laura's room. The lights were dimmed for night protocol, casting soft reflections across the glass. Laura's outline appeared doubled, reflected faintly against the corridor lights. He studied the scene quietly. He was not ready to name what he saw, but he could no longer ignore it. Numbers that aligned too neatly. Decisions that flowed too smoothly. A patient held in perfect balance, deprived of any chance to speak through her body. Dr. Carter turned away and walked down the hall, his expression tightened by resolve rather than anger. He understood that uncovering truth in medicine required patience, not accusation. Patterns mattered, documentation mattered, timing mattered. Behind him, the machines continued their steady cadence, indifferent to scrutiny. Laura remained suspended in controlled silence, her condition defined by data that told a story few were reading closely. As Dr. Carter disappeared around the corner, he carried with him the quiet certainty that something beneath the surface did not belong. The numbers did not lie, but they were not telling the whole truth. The VIP waiting area sat only a short distance from the intensive care unit, yet it felt like a different world entirely. Soft lighting replaced harsh fluorescence, and upholstered chairs absorbed sound instead of amplifying it. Conversations here were meant to be private, insulated from the beeping monitors and measured urgency down the hall. This was where decisions were discussed without witnesses. Daniel Mitchell entered the space with a relaxed posture, loosening his tie as if the tension of the day had already passed. He greeted his mother with a nod and accepted a glass of water from an attendant without comment. His expression carried fatigue, but not grief. The atmosphere seemed to give him permission to breathe. Margaret Mitchell settled into her chair and crossed her legs carefully, smoothing the fabric of her coat with practiced composure. She remarked that the hospital handled privacy well, noting the importance of discretion in sensitive situations. Daniel agreed quietly, glancing around the room with approval. They spoke as though attending a business meeting rather than waiting beside a comatose patient. Evelyn Brooks joined them moments later, her presence immediately shifting the tone of the gathering. She smiled easily and commented on the comfort of the space, mentioning that she had never seen a hospital manage luxury so effectively. Margaret responded with a faint smile of her own, clearly pleased by the observation. Daniel listened without interruption. Their conversation moved smoothly from logistics to lighter subjects, as if following an unspoken agreement to avoid anything uncomfortable. Daniel mentioned upcoming work obligations, explaining that schedules would need adjustment in the coming weeks. Margaret advised him not to neglect his responsibilities, reminding him that stability mattered during uncertain times. Evelyn nodded in agreement, adding that structure helped people cope. No one mentioned Laura by name at first. Her existence hovered just outside the conversation, acknowledged only indirectly through references to doctors and protocols. When she was mentioned, it was in abstract terms, framed by phrases like condition and outlook. There was no discussion of fear or hope, only management. A low laugh escaped Daniel as Evelyn made a comment about how unpredictable life could be. The sound was brief, almost reflexive, but it lingered in the quiet room. Margaret raised an eyebrow, then allowed herself a small smile. The moment passed quickly, absorbed into the comfortable rhythm of their exchange. Down the corridor, a nurse walked past the entrance to the VIP area and slowed slightly. She could hear voices through the partially closed door, casual and unhurried. The contrast struck her sharply, though she did not stop. She continued toward the ICU, carrying charts and concern with equal weight. Inside Laura's room, the lights remained steady and cool. Machines continued their repetitive cycle, counting breaths and heartbeats with impartial accuracy. Laura lay unmoving beneath the blanket, unaware of the conversation unfolding so nearby. Her body remained present, but her absence was complete. Back in the waiting area, Margaret shifted the conversation toward preparation. She spoke about contingencies, about being realistic, about not allowing emotion to cloud judgment. Her words were measured and calm, delivered with the authority of someone accustomed to control. Daniel listened carefully, absorbing her guidance without objection. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees as she spoke. She suggested that clarity would prevent confusion later, emphasizing the value of planning ahead. Her tone was reassuring, confident, as though she were offering help rather than influence. Margaret regarded her with quiet approval. Daniel glanced at his phone and silenced a notification, then placed it face down on the table. He remarked that the hospital staff seemed competent and responsive. Margaret agreed, adding that professionalism made situations like this easier to manage. Neither questioned the cost of such ease. A faint sound of laughter emerged again, this time from Evelyn, in response to a comment Daniel made about long hours and exhaustion. The sound was light, unburdened, entirely out of place within hospital walls. It did not last long, but its presence felt undeniable. It was the sound of relief, not sorrow. In the ICU hallway, Nurse Helen Moore paused outside Laura's room to review her notes. She adjusted her grip on the chart as the laughter reached her faintly through the corridor. Her eyes flicked toward the closed door of the VIP area, then back to Laura's still form behind the glass. She pressed her lips together and continued her work. Margaret eventually stood and announced that she would speak with administration about accommodations. She believed in staying ahead of potential complications. Daniel thanked her and rose as well, stretching his shoulders as if preparing to leave. Evelyn followed, slipping her phone into her bag. As they exited the waiting area, their voices softened, their expressions composed. Anyone passing by might have assumed they were concluding a routine meeting. The reality they were stepping away from remained sealed behind glass and protocol. Laura's monitor beeped steadily, marking time with quiet persistence. The sound echoed faintly into the hallway, unheard by those walking away. Her condition remained unchanged, suspended between presence and absence. The nurse entered Laura's room to check vitals, her movements efficient but gentle. She adjusted a line and recorded numbers that stayed within expected ranges. For a moment, she looked at Laura's face, searching for something familiar, something human. She found only stillness. Outside, the corridor lights reflected against the glass, creating faint, overlapping images. Laura appeared doubled, as if existing in two realities at once, one observed and discussed, the other silent and unreachable. In the VIP area, the chairs were already being straightened, the glasses collected. The room returned to its intended purpose, ready for the next conversation requiring comfort and privacy. The laughter that had filled it moments earlier left no trace. Back in the ICU, the night settled in slowly. Machines continued their work without pause or preference. Laura remained exactly where she had been, her body breathing, her voice absent. The distance between the waiting area and the hospital bed measured only a few steps. The distance between their worlds felt immeasurable. Dr. Samuel Carter did not announce his decision to act. It formed quietly, shaped by repetition, consistency, and a growing sense that routine had become concealment. He sat alone in his office early that morning, the hospital still settling into the day, and opened Laura Mitchell's digital record once more. This time, he did not read as a clinician assessing condition. He read as an archivist tracing sequence. He began with the admission timeline, scrolling slowly from the emergency delivery forward, noting each transition of care. The timestamps told a clean story on the surface, orderly and compliant with protocol. Yet the smoothness itself felt unnatural. Severe cases rarely moved without friction. Laura's course moved like a guided line. He exported the full medication history into a separate view, arranging entries chronologically instead of by category. When aligned this way, the escalation became unmistakable. Each increase followed the previous without deviation, each justified by language that sounded appropriate but revealed little. The margins between doses were narrow, but they accumulated. Dr. Carter opened the pharmacy verification logs next. Every medication had been dispensed on time, without delay, without override. The system recorded no alerts. Nothing had triggered automatic review. That, too, unsettled him. Medicine usually produced noise. Here, there was silence. He printed the pharmacy logs and placed them beside the medication chart. Then, he printed the vital sign records, focusing on blood pressure and heart rate variability. With a pen, he marked the moments of hypotension. The marks formed clusters. Each cluster corresponded to a medication adjustment. The pattern was no longer subtle. He leaned back and closed his eyes briefly. Not from fatigue, but from restraint. He reminded himself that patterns required confirmation, not assumption. Suspicion without structure could damage more than it revealed. What mattered was documentation, not instinct. He requested access to the raw monitor data, bypassing summarized charts in favor of waveform records. These showed the body's response in real time. Laura's physiological variability had narrowed steadily over weeks. Her body was being held within strict parameters, not allowed to fluctuate. Stability had become confinement. Dr. Carter saved copies of the data to a secure internal folder, labeling each file carefully with date and source. He noted nothing emotional in the file names. Precision mattered. If this ever needed explanation, clarity would protect truth better than language. Later that morning, Nurse Helen Moore joined him in the hallway outside his office. She did not ask why he had requested her presence. She already knew. Years of experience had taught her when concern crossed into necessity. She stood with her hands folded, posture formal, eyes alert. Dr. Carter asked her to walk him through Laura's daily care routine, step by step. Helen explained calmly, outlining medication administration, monitoring schedules, and response protocols. Her voice remained professional, but her pacing slowed when she reached sedation adjustments. She chose her words carefully. He asked whether Laura had ever shown spontaneous movement during lighter periods. Helen hesitated, then answered honestly. There had been moments that might have warranted reassessment, but orders remained unchanged. She had documented everything as instructed. There had been no formal directive to alter course. Dr. Carter thanked her and asked one more question. Had she ever felt uneasy about the progression? Helen did not answer immediately. Then she said she had felt uncomfortable, but not empowered. Consent had been documented. Authority had been clear. That was enough. Dr. Carter returned to his office and requested access to consent authorization logs. Each medication change carried approval, digitally signed. The signer was always the same, Daniel Mitchell. The speed of authorization stood out. There were no delays, no missed notifications. Approval followed proposal almost immediately. He cross-referenced the authorization times with Daniel's visit logs. The correlation was strong. Adjustments clustered around days Daniel had been present or available. This did not prove intent, but it proved involvement. In medicine, involvement carried responsibility. He compiled a timeline document, aligning admission events, medication changes, vital responses, and consent approvals on a single page. When viewed together, the progression was unmistakable. Laura's condition had been shaped, not merely observed. Dr. Carter printed the timeline and placed it in a plain folder. Then he printed supporting records and stacked them carefully. The pile grew thick. Each page added weight, not in accusation, but in clarity. This was not a single error. It was a sustained course. He locked the folder in his cabinet, not because he feared interference, but because process mattered. Evidence required protection from both tampering and premature exposure. There would be time for disclosure. Not yet. In the ICU, Helen continued her shift with measured calm. She administered medications, recorded vitals, and adjusted equipment as ordered. Nothing in her routine changed. Yet, her awareness had sharpened. She watched Laura's monitors with a new attentiveness, noting how little variation appeared. She looked at Laura's face during her checks, searching not for movement, but for contradiction. There was none. The stillness held. It felt engineered. That afternoon, Daniel Mitchell stopped briefly at the nurse's station. He asked whether there were updates, his tone polite and neutral. Helen responded with the standard summary, stable, no change. Daniel nodded and thanked her. He did not ask to see Dr. Carter. Dr. Carter observed the exchange from a distance. He did not intervene. Information gathered quietly held more power than confrontation. He made another copy of the folder contents, storing it in a separate, secure location within the hospital system. Before leaving for the day, he reviewed the folder one final time. Each document aligned, each timestamp matched. There were no gaps, no anomalies, no missing links. The absence of chaos was the strongest signal. He closed the cabinet and locked it, the sound sharp in the quiet office. The hospital lights dimmed slightly as evening approached, signaling shift changes and reduced foot traffic. Outside, the corridor remained calm, unaware of what had just been assembled. Laura lay in her room, unchanged, her body breathing within narrow margins defined by numbers and decisions. She did not know that a record of her silence now existed, preserved not as memory, but as evidence. Dr. Carter left the unit without urgency, walking the corridor with steady purpose. He did not carry the folder with him. He carried something heavier. Certainty formed not by emotion, but by alignment. The story written in data could no longer be unseen. The file was complete enough to stand on its own, not to accuse, but to reveal. And once revealed, it would no longer belong to those who believed control could remain invisible. The night shift began without ceremony, marked only by dimmed lights and quieter footsteps along the intensive care corridor. The hospital settled into its nocturnal rhythm, machines humming steadily as staff moved with practiced restraint. Inside Laura Mitchell's room, the environment looked unchanged, controlled and still, shaped by routine rather than expectation. A nurse checked the monitors and noted stable readings, heart rate consistent, oxygen levels holding, blood pressure within the same narrow range maintained for days. She adjusted a setting, recorded the numbers, and prepared to move on. Nothing in the data suggested urgency. Nothing hinted at change. Minutes later, a subtle irregularity appeared on the screen. The heart rhythm shifted slightly, not enough to trigger an alarm, but enough to catch a trained eye. The nurse paused and leaned closer, watching the waveform settle, then shift again. She checked the connections, confirming there was no technical interference. Laura's chest rose with mechanical assistance, then hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing. It was brief, easily dismissed, yet distinct. The nurse pressed a button to call the charge desk, her voice calm as she reported the variation. She remained by the bedside, watching closely. Another breath passed, then another. Laura's eyelids fluttered once, barely perceptible beneath the dim lighting. The nurse inhaled sharply, then steadied herself, leaning forward to observe. The movement did not repeat immediately. Silence returned, broken only by the steady hiss of the ventilator. The charge nurse arrived moments later, followed by a resident physician. They reviewed the monitor together, comparing current readings to the recent trend. The data still fell within acceptable parameters. Yet the nurse pointed out the momentary deviation, her finger resting on the screen. The physician nodded, acknowledging the observation. They decided to reduce stimulation and continue close monitoring. The resident adjusted a setting and documented the change. The room returned to quiet watchfulness, staff stepping back but not leaving. Something had shifted, even if it could not yet be named. Several minutes passed. Then Laura's fingers twitched beneath the blanket. It was small, almost involuntary, but unmistakable. The nurse moved closer again, her focus sharp, her posture alert. She called Laura's name softly, not as protocol, but as instinct. Laura did not respond immediately. Her breathing pattern altered slightly, becoming less uniform. The ventilator compensated, adjusting flow automatically. The resident leaned in, checking pupillary response with a small flashlight. Laura's eyes reacted faintly, sluggish but present. The nurse felt her throat tighten as she spoke into the intercom, requesting the attending physician. Her voice remained professional, but urgency threaded beneath the calm. This was no longer a question of observation. This was emergence. Dr. Samuel Carter arrived quickly, his expression focused but controlled. He reviewed the monitor, then Laura herself, noting the subtle changes in muscle tone and respiratory effort. He asked for a brief reduction in sedation, explaining his reasoning without hesitation. The adjustment was made. The room held its breath. Laura's eyes opened. At first, they remained unfocused, drifting without recognition. Her brow tightened slightly, a faint crease forming as sensation returned. Her breathing grew uneven, fighting the rhythm imposed by the machine. A soft sound escaped her throat, more reflex than voice. The nurse spoke to her again, this time clearly, gently guiding her through the confusion. Laura's eyes moved toward the sound, lingering there as if anchoring. Her gaze did not yet comprehend, but awareness had entered the room. Dr. Carter observed closely, asking simple questions. Laura did not answer verbally, but her eyes reacted, blinking in response. Tears welled suddenly, spilling down her temples into her hair. The nurse wiped them away carefully, her hands steady despite the emotion rising in her chest. Laura's breathing grew labored as panic surfaced. The unfamiliar environment, the restraints of tubing, the absence of control pressed in at once. The nurse placed a hand on her shoulder, applying gentle pressure. She spoke calmly, explaining where Laura was, that she was safe, that help was present. The resident adjusted the ventilator support slightly to accommodate Laura's effort. "Doctor?" Carter watched for signs of distress, then nodded when her vitals stabilized again. This was not a full awakening, but it was undeniable progress. News traveled quickly through the unit. Staff paused outside the room, careful not to intrude, exchanging brief glances of recognition. A patient long considered static had shifted state. The atmosphere changed, subtle but real. Dr. Carter requested that Daniel Mitchell be informed. The call was placed, the message delivered with measured language. Laura had shown signs of consciousness. Further evaluation was underway. There was no speculation offered, only fact. Daniel arrived within the hour, his expression guarded as he entered the corridor. He spoke briefly with staff, absorbing the update without visible reaction. When he approached the glass, he stopped short, watching Laura with a mixture of surprise and calculation. Inside the room, Laura's eyes had closed again, exhaustion overtaking the fragile alertness. Her body had expended more energy in those minutes than it had in weeks. The nurse adjusted the blanket and checked the lines, ensuring stability. Dr. Carter explained to Daniel that spontaneous response had occurred. He emphasized that the process would be gradual, unpredictable, requiring careful assessment. Daniel nodded, asking whether this altered the overall outlook. "Doctor," Carter answered honestly, stating that it changed the conversation. Daniel thanked him and stepped back, his face unreadable. He made no move to enter the room. As the night deepened, Laura remained in a lightened state of sedation, her body no longer entirely still. Small movements appeared intermittently, fingers flexing, facial muscles tightening as sensation filtered through. Each response was documented carefully, time-stamped and observed. The nurse remained close, adjusting her routine to accommodate the change. She spoke softly during checks, offering reassurance even when Laura did not appear to hear. The room felt different now, less like a holding space, more like a threshold. Near dawn, Laura stirred again. Her eyes opened briefly, focusing on the nurse's face. Her lips moved, forming a sound too faint to interpret. The nurse leaned closer, listening. The sound came again, broken and strained. Laura whispered a single word. The nurse did not ask her to repeat it. She already knew. Doctor. Carter returned to the room, reviewing the overnight notes with careful attention. The documentation was clear. Consciousness had emerged. The trajectory had changed. Laura was no longer an abstract condition. As daylight filtered through the narrow window, Laura rested, her breathing steadier, her body spent. The machines continued their work, but now they accompanied rather than controlled. Something essential had shifted. Laura Mitchell was awake enough to be present, even briefly. And in that presence, the balance of power within the room had quietly begun to change. Laura Mitchell drifted in and out of awareness throughout the morning, her consciousness fragile and easily pulled under by exhaustion. Each time she surfaced, the room felt unfamiliar, filled with muted sounds and filtered light. Her body ached in ways she could not yet understand, and every breath reminded her that something had gone terribly wrong. Dr. Samuel Carter waited until her vitals stabilized before approaching her bedside again. He did not rush the moment or crowd her with information. He pulled a chair close, lowering himself to her eye level, ensuring she could see his face clearly. His voice remained steady, calm, and deliberate. Laura's eyes followed him slowly as he spoke her name. She reacted to the sound with a faint tightening around her eyes, recognition struggling through fatigue. Doctor. Carter explained where she was and why, choosing simple language that did not overwhelm. He told her she had been asleep for a long time, and that waking was a positive sign. She tried to speak, but her throat felt raw and uncooperative. A soft sound escaped instead, followed by a breath that turned into a quiet sob. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, slipping down into her hair. The nurse at her side wiped them gently, saying nothing, allowing the emotion to pass without interruption. When Laura's breathing steadied, Dr. Carter continued. He told her about the twins. He said they were alive, small but stable, being cared for nearby. The words reached her slowly, but when they did, her reaction was immediate. Her eyes widened, and a tremor passed through her body. Relief and grief collided inside her chest. She tried again to speak, her lips forming silent questions. Dr. Carter understood. He nodded and reassured her that she would see them, but not yet. Her body needed time. He watched her closely, ensuring she did not become overwhelmed by the information. After a pause, he shifted the conversation carefully. He explained that he needed to discuss something difficult. Laura's gaze sharpened slightly, sensing the change in tone. Doctor? Carter did not soften his words with false comfort. He told her the truth as it existed, grounded in facts and documentation. He explained that during her coma, medical decisions had been made on her behalf. He said those decisions had been legally authorized. Laura listened, her expression tightening as comprehension formed. When he mentioned consent forms, her breathing changed again, shallow and quick. Dr. Carter told her who had signed them. He said Daniel Mitchell's name plainly, without accusation, without hesitation. The words landed heavily, filling the space between them. Laura's eyes searched his face, hoping for correction, for nuance, for something that would make the statement less absolute. He continued gently, explaining that medication levels had been adjusted repeatedly under that authorization. He said the pattern concerned him. He did not use words like harm or intent. He spoke only of facts, of timing, of records. He said he believed she deserved to know. Laura stared at the ceiling, her mind struggling to reconcile the information with memory. Images surfaced in fragments, moments of distance, arguments left unresolved, expressions she had dismissed as stress. Her hands curled slightly beneath the blanket, fingers pressing into the fabric as if anchoring herself. A sound escaped her throat, half question, half disbelief. Dr. Carter leaned closer to hear her. She managed to whisper Daniel's name, the word breaking as it left her lips. The nurse placed a hand over hers, grounding her through touch. "Doctor?" Carter did not answer the question. Laura did not finish. Instead, he told her what mattered next. He said she had choices now. He said her awareness changed everything. He explained that her consent would soon be required for further care. Her voice mattered again. Laura closed her eyes briefly, tears slipping free without resistance. Pain settled deep in her chest, heavier than the physical ache. Betrayal did not arrive as anger. It arrived as a hollow space where trust had lived. When she opened her eyes again, they were clearer, more focused. She looked at Dr. Carter and asked for time, her voice weak but steady. He nodded immediately, telling her she would not be rushed. He assured her that nothing further would proceed without her understanding. Later that afternoon, when Laura had rested, Dr. Carter returned with an update. He explained that a legal representative could be contacted if she wished. He emphasized that this was her decision, not an obligation. Laura listened quietly, absorbing the implication. She asked whether Daniel had been informed of her awakening. Dr. Carter answered honestly, stating that he had been notified of the medical change, not the conversation. Laura nodded, absorbing that distinction. Her face hardened slightly, resolve beginning to replace shock. She asked about her children again, her voice trembling but determined. The nurse explained their condition in careful detail, describing weight gain, feeding schedules, the sound of their monitors. Laura listened intently, committing each word to memory as if it were oxygen. When the room grew quiet again, Laura stared at her hands. They looked unfamiliar, thinner than she remembered, marked by bruises and tape. She flexed her fingers slowly, testing her ability to move. Control felt distant, but awareness remained. Dr. Carter returned once more before evening, this time with a folder tucked under his arm. He did not open it. He placed it on the table within Laura's sight, explaining that it contained records related to her care. He told her she did not need to look at it yet. He only wanted her to know it existed. Laura watched the folder as if it were something alive. She understood instinctively that it held answers she was not yet ready to face. She nodded once, acknowledging its presence, then turned her gaze back to Dr. Carter. She whispered a request. She wanted help, not medical help, but protection. The words came slowly, shaped by fatigue and fear, but they were clear. Dr. Carter heard them and nodded without surprise. He told her he would contact a lawyer experienced in patient advocacy and medical law. He explained that this person would represent her interests and ensure her voice remained central. Laura closed her eyes, relief mixing with exhaustion. As evening approached, the nurse dimmed the lights and adjusted the room for rest. Laura's body relaxed slightly, though her mind remained active. Thoughts moved in fragments, circling around trust lost and responsibility reclaimed. She did not think about confrontation or revenge. She thought about survival. She thought about her children. She thought about staying awake long enough to hold them. The room grew quiet again, filled with the familiar hum of machines, yet the silence felt different now. It no longer swallowed her, it waited. Laura Mitchell lay awake, fragile but present, her truth no longer hidden from her. In that awareness, painful as it was, she felt something steady beneath the fear. Her voice had returned, and with it, the first fragile sense of control over what would come next. The conference room felt colder than the ICU, though no machines hummed and no alarms waited to sound. Glass walls reflected overhead lights, and a long table divided the space with deliberate symmetry. Chairs were arranged with care, water pitchers filled, notepads aligned, as if order itself might determine the outcome. Daniel Mitchell entered first, his posture composed, his expression guarded but controlled. He took a seat near the center, setting his phone face down, signaling attention without vulnerability. Margaret Mitchell followed closely, choosing a chair beside him, her movements precise and unhurried. Evelyn Brooks arrived moments later, heels quiet against the floor, confidence evident in the way she scanned the room. She selected a seat slightly apart, crossing her legs with practiced ease. Her presence altered the atmosphere immediately, though no one commented on it. The door opened again, and Dr. Samuel Carter stepped inside, carrying a plain folder held firmly under his arm. He did not rush or pause for effect. He acknowledged the room with a nod and took a seat across from the family, placing the folder on the table. An attorney sat beside Dr. Carter, introduced briefly as patient counsel, neutral in expression, attentive in posture. The title alone shifted the balance of the room. Daniel noticed immediately, his eyes flicking toward the folder before returning to Dr. Carter's face. Dr. Carter spoke first, his voice calm, measured, and precise. He explained that the meeting concerned Laura Mitchell's care and recent developments. He emphasized that the purpose was clarity, not accusation. His words set boundaries without softening their intent. Daniel responded politely, stating his understanding and appreciation for transparency. Margaret nodded in agreement, her lips pressed together in a thin line. Evelyn leaned back slightly, her expression curious rather than concerned. Dr. Carter placed both hands on the folder, then slid it gently toward the center of the table. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he explained how the contents had been compiled, referencing timelines, records, and standard review procedures. His tone remained clinical, deliberate. He opened the folder and began removing documents, laying them out one by one. Medication logs appeared first, neatly ordered. Consent authorizations followed, each bearing timestamps and digital signatures. Vital sign charts were placed last, aligned carefully for comparison. As the documents spread across the table, the room grew quieter. The air felt heavier, charged not by volume, but by recognition. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his attention fixed on the papers. Margaret's gaze sharpened, scanning details with practiced scrutiny. Dr. Carter began to explain the sequence, pointing to dates and corresponding adjustments. He described how each medication change aligned with specific physiological responses. He avoided interpretive language, allowing the alignment itself to speak. The attorney added brief clarifications when necessary, translating medical terminology into plain language. He emphasized that each decision had been legally authorized. He did not suggest wrongdoing, only responsibility. The distinction mattered. Daniel interrupted once, asking whether any action taken fell outside accepted medical standards. Dr. Carter answered directly, stating that individual decisions fell within guidelines. The issue, he explained, was cumulative effect and sustained pattern. Margaret interjected, questioning whether such patterns could occur coincidentally. Dr. Carter acknowledged the possibility, then pointed to the frequency and timing. He referenced comparable cases, noting the absence of similar trajectories. His delivery remained composed, unwavering. Evelyn shifted in her seat, her confidence faltering slightly. She glanced toward Daniel, then back to the documents. Her earlier ease gave way to calculation, her posture tightening as the implications settled. Dr. Carter reached the final page, a consolidated timeline aligning consent approvals with medication escalation and physiological response. He placed it flat on the table and stepped back slightly. The presentation was complete. Silence followed, long enough to feel deliberate. The attorney waited, hands folded, allowing space for reaction. Daniel stared at the timeline, his jaw tightening. Margaret's fingers tapped once against the table, then stopped. Daniel spoke again, his voice lower, more cautious. He asked whether Laura had been informed of these findings. Dr. Carter answered simply, stating that she had been told the facts relevant to her care. He did not elaborate. Margaret's expression hardened. She questioned the necessity of legal involvement. The attorney responded calmly, explaining that Laura's regained awareness restored her right to direct care decisions. Representation ensured those rights were protected. Evelyn finally spoke, her tone defensive, questioning why she was present at all. The attorney replied that her presence had been documented throughout Laura's hospitalization. Her involvement made her relevant. The words landed sharply, stripping away pretense. Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple as he leaned back. The composure he had maintained began to fracture. He asked what would happen next. "Doctor." Carter answered that no further decisions would proceed without Laura's explicit consent. The shift was unmistakable. Authority moved away from those accustomed to holding it. The documents remained on the table, immovable, undeniable. They did not accuse, but they did not retreat. Margaret gathered herself and asked whether the hospital intended to escalate the matter. Dr. Carter responded that the hospital intended to honor patient rights and clinical integrity. Any further steps would depend on Laura's wishes. The attorney closed his notebook and stated that future communication regarding Laura's care would be directed through counsel. His tone was firm but respectful. Boundaries were being drawn, clearly and permanently. Evelyn stood abruptly, her chair scraping softly against the floor. She muttered that this was unnecessary and moved toward the door. No one stopped her. Her exit felt smaller than her arrival, stripped of influence. Daniel remained seated, staring at the documents as if expecting them to change. Margaret placed a hand on his arm, though her gesture lacked comfort. The power she had wielded moments earlier had diminished. Dr. Carter gathered the documents carefully, returning them to the folder. He did not rush, nor did he linger. The point had been made. He met Daniel's eyes briefly, then looked away, signaling closure. As the meeting ended, the room felt altered, its careful arrangement no longer neutral. The table bore the memory of what had been revealed. Control had shifted without raised voices or dramatic gestures. Outside the conference room, footsteps echoed faintly as the group dispersed. The hallway resumed its routine pace, unaware of the quiet reckoning that had just occurred. Back in the ICU, Laura Mitchell rested, unaware of the confrontation conducted in her name. Machines continued their steady rhythm, but the decisions guiding them had changed. The folder now rested in Dr. Carter's hands, no longer hidden, no longer dormant. Its contents had done their work. In a single room, through documents and measured words, the balance of power had turned, and nothing would return to the way it had been before. The days following the meeting unfolded with a precision that felt both inevitable and unsettling. What had been confined to conference rooms and secured folders began to move outward into formal systems. Documentation traveled from hospital administration to regulatory authorities, each transfer quiet but deliberate. The process no longer belonged to individuals. It belonged to institutions. Laura Mitchell's legal counsel arrived early that morning, carrying copies of filings that reframed her status completely. Guardianship authority previously assumed by Daniel Mitchell was formally suspended pending review. Notices were delivered through official channels, stamped and verified. The shift was procedural, yet its impact was immediate. Daniel received the notice without ceremony, standing in a hallway far removed from the ICU. He read the document twice, his expression tightening with each line. The language was neutral, unemotional, and precise. It did not accuse him, it removed him. Margaret Mitchell attempted to intervene through familiar contacts, placing calls that once would have produced quick responses. This time, the replies were measured and distant. Processes were underway. Oversight had been engaged. Influence no longer moved freely. Evelyn Brooks learned of the change indirectly, through a brief message sent by Daniel. Her response was sharp, demanding explanation, but none came. She soon realized her access had vanished. Hospital security no longer recognized her as authorized. Her presence was no longer tolerated. Within the hospital, protocols adjusted seamlessly. Laura's care plan was revised under her direct consent, documented carefully at each step. No medication changes proceeded without explanation and confirmation. The room itself felt different, quieter in a way that suggested respect rather than control. Dr. Samuel Carter submitted his findings to the appropriate medical review board, accompanied by full documentation. His report avoided speculation, focusing solely on chronology, consent, and physiological response. He let the record speak. In medicine, clarity often carried more weight than accusation. The board acknowledged receipt within hours, initiating a preliminary inquiry. This did not yet constitute judgment, but it marked recognition. Questions would be asked. Answers would be required. The matter had crossed a threshold. Law enforcement was notified through standard reporting channels related to patient safety. Officers did not arrive with urgency or spectacle. They requested records, interviews, and timelines. Their presence was calm, professional, and unmistakable. Daniel's attorney contacted Laura's counsel, seeking clarification and restraint. The response was firm and brief. All communication would proceed through official review. No private arrangements would be considered. Boundaries had been drawn. Media attention followed soon after, sparked by a regulatory filing that became public record. Reporters gathered outside the hospital, cameras angled toward entrances and exits. Headlines avoided sensational language, instead framing the situation as an investigation into medical oversight and consent authority. Daniel watched the coverage from his office, the sound muted. His name appeared repeatedly, accompanied by phrases like suspended authority and patient advocacy review. He recognized the language of liability. It was not loud, but it was persistent. Margaret issued a brief statement through a family representative, emphasizing cooperation and concern for Laura's recovery. The statement said little and promised less. It did not halt the momentum already in motion. Evelyn attempted to distance herself publicly, declining comment and canceling appearances. Her name appeared less frequently, but not entirely absent. Records documented her presence during critical periods. Silence did not erase documentation. Inside the hospital, Laura remained insulated from the noise. Her recovery continued at a measured pace, supported by staff now acutely aware of scrutiny. Nurses documented with heightened precision. Physicians consulted more frequently. Care was no longer routine. It was intentional. Laura met briefly with investigators in the presence of her attorney, her voice still weak but steady. She answered questions simply, describing what she remembered and what she had been told. She did not speculate. She stated facts. Her testimony carried weight precisely because it avoided emotion. The investigators listened carefully, taking notes without interruption. They asked about consent, awareness, and understanding. Laura answered when she could, pausing when fatigue overtook her. The session ended with quiet acknowledgement, rather than resolution. Daniel was interviewed later that day in a separate location. He spoke calmly, emphasizing reliance on medical guidance and intent to ensure stability. His words mirrored those he had used before. This time, they were recorded, preserved, and evaluated. As inquiries expanded, financial records were requested, not for punishment, but for context. Timing mattered. Patterns mattered. Responsibility was being mapped across systems rather than individuals alone. The hospital issued an internal memorandum reaffirming patient rights and consent standards. Training sessions were scheduled. Compliance reviews were announced. The institution moved quickly to demonstrate accountability. Damage control was not defensive. It was procedural. Public response remained restrained, shaped by the absence of spectacle. There were no dramatic arrests, no shouted accusations. Instead, there was a steady accumulation of consequence. Careers paused, reputations wavered, certainty dissolved. Daniel's company placed him on temporary leave, pending resolution of the inquiry. The announcement cited focus and discretion. Investors reacted cautiously. Control slipped further from his grasp, not through force, but through structure. Margaret retreated from public view, limiting appearances and communication. Her influence had been effective within private spaces. Public systems proved less responsive. Evelyn's social circle thinned rapidly as association became liability. Invitations ceased. Messages went unanswered. Proximity to the investigation carried risk. Laura learned of these developments secondhand, through brief updates delivered by her attorney. She listened without reaction, conserving energy for healing. Justice, she understood, moved independently of her emotions. What mattered was that decisions were no longer made without her knowledge. Her consent was required, documented, respected. That alone marked a profound shift. As the days passed, the investigation continued, methodical and quiet. There were no conclusions yet, only progress. Each step affirmed that the matter would not disappear. The hospital returned to its rhythms, though altered by awareness. Outside, cameras lingered, then gradually dispersed. Attention shifted elsewhere, but the process remained. Laura lay resting, her body recovering within boundaries she now understood and accepted. Around her, systems adjusted, recalibrated by accountability. Justice had not arrived with noise or triumph. It had arrived through procedure, oversight, and the steady insistence that no life should be governed without voice. Recovery did not arrive as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual reclaiming of ordinary moments once taken for granted. Laura Mitchell learned to measure progress in quiet victories, like sitting upright without dizziness or holding a conversation without exhaustion. Each morning brought a little more strength, and with it, a clearer sense of self returning. The hospital room no longer felt like a place of suspension. Sunlight filtered through the narrow window, warming the floor in soft rectangles. Nurses entered with familiar faces and gentler routines, speaking to Laura directly and waiting for her consent before every adjustment. The machines still hummed, but they no longer defined her presence. The first time Laura was wheeled into the neonatal unit, her hands trembled despite her resolve. The room smelled faintly of sanitizer and warm fabric, and the air carried a constant hush of careful movement. When she saw her twins, so small and fragile, emotion pressed sharply against her chest. A nurse guided Laura closer, explaining each tube and monitor with calm reassurance. Laura listened, nodding slowly, afraid that speaking might break the moment. When her fingers brushed the incubator glass, tears filled her eyes, not from fear, but from overwhelming relief. They were here. She was here. Holding them came later, after strength returned and doctors approved brief contact. The weight of each child rested against her chest, lighter than she imagined, yet powerful enough to steady her breathing. Laura closed her eyes and memorized the sensation, grounding herself in the warmth she had nearly lost. Discharge planning began quietly, without fanfare. Physical therapy sessions replaced long hours of observation. Laura practiced standing, walking, and climbing a single step at a time. The work was slow and humbling, but she welcomed the effort. Pain now felt purposeful. Her attorney visited occasionally, offering updates with restraint and clarity. Investigations continued, reviews remained ongoing, and outcomes would take time. Laura listened politely, then redirected the conversation toward her children. Justice mattered, but healing demanded attention. She chose where to place her energy. When the day came to leave the hospital, it felt strangely understated. A nurse handed Laura a folder of instructions, medications, and follow-up appointments. Another adjusted a blanket around the twins. The hallway doors opened, and fresh air greeted them without ceremony. Outside, the world moved as it always had. Cars passed, voices carried, and the sky stretched wide and indifferent. Laura paused briefly, breathing deeply, grounding herself in the reality of standing on her own feet. This moment did not feel triumphant. It felt real. Home was smaller than the life she once knew, but it felt safer. The space held only what was necessary, free from echoes of control and expectation. Nights were long and broken by feedings, but Laura welcomed the fatigue. Every cry meant life. Every response reminded her she was needed. Support arrived quietly from places she had not expected. A neighbor offered meals without questions. A nurse from the hospital checked in once, simply to ask how she was coping. These gestures carried no obligation, only presence. Laura learned to accept help without shame. She did not return to her former routines or relationships. Some connections faded naturally, others were set aside intentionally. Laura no longer felt compelled to explain her choices. Survival had clarified her priorities with unforgiving honesty. The legal process continued without her participation. Documents moved, hearings were scheduled, and decisions were rendered far from her daily life. Laura trusted the system to proceed without her vigilance. She had done her part by speaking. Now she focused on living. One afternoon, while rocking her twins in the quiet of the living room, Laura reflected on the silence that once defined her existence. That silence had been imposed, shaped by decisions made without her voice. This silence was different. It was chosen. It offered rest rather than erasure. She thought often about the thin line between care and control, between authority and accountability. The experience had altered her understanding of trust permanently, yet it had also revealed resilience she had not known she possessed. Dr. Carter sent a brief note weeks later, wishing her continued recovery. There were no updates, no commentary, only acknowledgement. Laura appreciated the restraint. Some chapters closed without explanation, and that was enough. As months passed, routines formed around the twins, their growth steady and reassuring. Laura marked milestones quietly, celebrating progress without announcing it to the world. Joy no longer needed witnesses to feel valid. On evenings when exhaustion settled deeply, Laura reminded herself of the distance she had traveled, not in miles or milestones, but in awareness. She was no longer invisible within her own life. Her choices carried weight again. She did not dwell on anger or loss. Those emotions surfaced occasionally, then passed. What remained was a calm determination to protect what mattered. Laura understood now that safety was not guaranteed by proximity or promise, but by agency. The future remained undefined, as futures often are. Yet Laura no longer feared uncertainty. She had faced the absence of control and survived it. Whatever came next would meet a woman who knew her worth. One night, as she settled the twins into their cribs, Laura lingered for a moment, watching their steady breathing. The room was quiet, filled with ordinary sounds. She felt tired, grounded, and present. There was no dramatic closing, no statement of victory. Life continued, shaped by quiet choices and deliberate care. Laura turned off the light and stepped back, confident in the knowledge that this time, her story belonged to her.